The price of power. Sloane Wexley's fall from grace. She defied the judge, challenged the law, even fought the bailiff. But nothing could prepare her for the sentence that shattered her world. Part 1. The entrance. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the back wall, their cameras lowered but ready. A few whispered among themselves, already crafting headlines before the hearing even began. At the front, attorneys shuffled through thick files, murmuring last-minute strategies. The moment everyone was waiting for had arrived. Sloane Wexley strode in not as a woman on trial, but as a woman who owned the room. Tall, effortlessly poised, dressed in a crisp, tailored white suit that likely cost more than the annual salary of half the people present. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a severe bun that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and piercing green eyes. She moved with the assurance of someone who had never heard the word no in her life. She didn't glance at the rows of spectators watching her every move. She didn't acknowledge the legal team seated at her table. The ones she'd paid handsomely to clean up the mess she still refused to admit was her fault. And she certainly didn't seem fazed by the weight of the charges against her. Securities fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. As she settled into her seat, she let out a quiet exhale, barely masking her irritation. This was an inconvenience, nothing more. A temporary PR nightmare that would be forgotten within months, drowned out by the next corporate scandal. "She looks confident," whispered a young reporter to her colleague. Too confident for someone facing 20 years. The colleague, a veteran courtroom reporter who had seen countless powerful people face justice, simply shrugged. They all do, at first. At precisely 9 a.m., the bailiff stepped forward. His voice, firm but practiced, echoed through the chamber. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Dorian Langston." The room shifted. Chairs scraped against the polished floors as the crowd obeyed. Even Sloane's own attorneys pushed themselves up, some hesitating when they realized she hadn't moved an inch. She remained seated, one leg crossed over the other, perfectly manicured fingers resting against her knee. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of amusement in her eyes, as if she were watching a test play out in real time, waiting to see who would dare to challenge her. The murmur started immediately. A few gasps, a sharp intake of breath from someone near the front. The reporters, they weren't whispering anymore. Judge Langston stepped onto the bench, adjusting his robe with practiced ease. He was a man of few wasted words and even fewer wasted glances. At 57, he had presided over some of the most complex cases in the country, earning a reputation for his sharp intellect, unwavering composure, and an intolerance for theatrics. He didn't need theatrics. His presence alone commanded the room. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at her. The silence dragged, stretching so long that even the court stenographer glanced up, sensing something unusual was happening. Then, in a voice that was steady but firm, Judge Langston spoke. "Miss Wexley, this court follows standard procedure. I expect you to do the same." Sloane's lips curled slightly, not a smile. Something closer to a smirk. She leaned back, exuding the kind of ease that only comes from absolute confidence. "I stand for people I respect, Your Honor." The words landed like a slap across the room. Someone audibly inhaled. One of her attorneys, a younger man with nervous hands, instinctively turned toward her, his face tightening as if he were about to say something, then thought better of it. Judge Langston, to his credit, didn't flinch. If her words affected him, he didn't show it. "That is your choice," he said simply. Then he turned his attention to the prosecution. Just like that, the moment passed. But the tension didn't. Sloane expected more, expected outrage, expected a reaction. But instead, she was met with something worse: indifference. The judge had acknowledged her defiance and dismissed it in the same breath. He hadn't played into her game, hadn't scolded her, hadn't done anything to make her feel as important as she believed herself to be. It was a miscalculation on her part. And miscalculations weren't something Sloane Wexley was used to. But she wasn't done yet. And the next move she made would send a shockwave through the courtroom. Part 2. The prosecution. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to proceed." Judge Langston gave a slight nod. Proceed. Assistant District Attorney Troy Benson stood, buttoning his suit jacket with measured precision. He was a man who had built his career on tearing down the powerful, and today, his focus was locked on Sloane Wexley. The case against Ms. Wexley is clear, he began, his voice resonating with conviction. The evidence we will present demonstrates beyond any doubt that she engaged in willful fraud, knowingly misleading investors, fabricating numbers, and obstructing investigations into her company's financial misconduct. Sloane barely reacted. She sat with the same unreadable expression, the same effortless confidence, as if Benson were describing the weather and not offenses that could put her behind bars for decades. Her lead attorney, Marshall Grayson, rose next. He was an expensive fixer, one of those lawyers whose name alone sent a message, "I don't lose." He adjusted his cuffs before speaking, his voice smooth, controlled. "Your Honor, my client is a target not because she's guilty, but because she's successful. The prosecution is desperate for a win. They want a high-profile takedown to justify their budget. That's what this is about." Sloane allowed herself a slight approving nod. "That's more like it." But Judge Langston didn't react. He simply turned toward Benson. "Call your first witness." The prosecution's first witness was Daniel Cho, a former financial officer at Wexley Technologies. As he took the stand, he barely looked at Sloane. When he did, it was fleeting, something between nervousness and quiet resentment. Benson wasted no time. "Mr. Cho, during your time at Wexley Technologies, were you instructed to alter financial reports?" Cho hesitated. His fingers twitched against his lap. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sloane exhaled, barely masking her irritation. This was already going exactly as she expected. The parade of so-called whistleblowers eager to paint her as the villain. "And who gave you that instruction?" Benson pressed. Cho swallowed. "Miss Wexley." This time, the reaction was louder. One of the reporters scribbled something furiously, the click of their pen punctuating the heavy silence. Sloane let out a quiet laugh, a tiny, dismissive scoff, just loud enough to be heard. It was the kind of laugh that said, "This is ridiculous, and I refuse to take it seriously." Judge Langston's gaze flickered toward her, but before he could say anything, she did something no one expected. She stood. Her chair scraped against the polished floor, cutting through the tension like a blade. Marshall Grayson stiffened. He turned toward her, his lips barely parting, as if he wanted to say sit down but knew better than to try. The courtroom fell into a strange, unnatural silence. Sloane didn't address the judge, didn't look at her lawyers. She turned her attention straight to Daniel Cho. "Tell me, Daniel," she said, her voice smooth but laced with something dangerous. "When exactly did I instruct you to do this?" Cho's throat bobbed. "Miss Wexley." "No, really," she continued, tilting her head. "Was it in an email? A phone call? A memo? Or is this just another case of an underqualified employee looking for an excuse?" Gasps rippled through the room. Benson stepped forward immediately. "Your Honor." Judge Langston lifted a hand. "Miss Wexley, sit down." She didn't. Instead, she folded her arms. "I have a right to confront my accuser." Marshall Grayson inhaled sharply. This was bad. Very bad. Judge Langston's stare was measured, unreadable. "You have a right to a defense, Miss Wexley. You do not have the right to disrupt my courtroom." Sloane's smirk returned, just a flicker of it. "Disrupt? I'm just asking a question." His lying. The tension was unbearable now. Every eye in the room bounced between Sloane and the judge, waiting for what would happen next. Judge Langston leaned forward slightly. "This is my last warning. Sit down." But Sloane Wexley didn't take orders. Not from board members, not from regulators, and certainly not from a judge. What she did next would send the courtroom into chaos. Part 3. The Contempt. Sloane's pulse was steady, her breath even, but there was something simmering beneath the surface. A flicker of frustration, a whisper of something she wouldn't name. She wasn't used to being controlled, and she certainly wasn't used to being dismissed. She exhaled slowly, then without warning, turned her back on the judge. Gasps rang out across the room. One of her attorneys stiffened so suddenly that his chair nearly toppled. The stenographer froze, fingers hovering above the keyboard. No defendant ever turned their back on a federal judge. It was an unspoken rule, an acknowledgement that in this space, authority belonged to the bench. But Sloane Wexley? She didn't recognize authority. She didn't respect it. Judge Langston didn't move. His expression didn't change. Face this court, Miss Wexley. Sloane didn't. Instead, she reached for the glass of water on the table, lifted it to her lips, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Ms. Wexley. Still, she didn't turn. Her legal team looked horrified. One of her junior attorneys, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white, leaned in as if he were about to whisper something, but he never got the chance. Because Judge Langston's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Bailiff. A ripple of tension crashed over the room, and then it happened. The bailiff stepped forward. A large man, broad shoulders, square jaw, voice steady. I need you to turn and face the judge. Sloane didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge him at all. Her entire posture was a message. I don't answer to you. The air in the courtroom shifted. The spectators could feel it now, something more than tension, more than arrogance. Defiance. Pure, reckless defiance. And then, without a word, the bailiff reached for her arm. The moment his hand touched her, everything exploded. Sloane Wexley, billionaire, corporate queen, untouchable icon, snapped. She yanked her arm away with a sharp, violent jerk, twisting out of the bailiff's grasp. The movement sent her water glass crashing to the floor, shattering on impact. Someone screamed. Papers rustled. Attorneys jumped to their feet. A security officer moved forward, hand hovering near his belt. Sloane's breathing was heavier now, her shoulders rising and falling. For the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not arrogance, not amusement. Pure, uncontrolled rage. Judge Langston exhaled slowly, his fingers laced together but his gaze unwavering. Miss Wexley, you've just made a very costly mistake. Her jaw clenched. Her nails dug into her palm. And for the first time since stepping into that courtroom, Sloane realized she wasn't in control. Not anymore. Because the consequences of her actions had just begun. The room was frozen. Sloane Wexley, the woman who had dominated boardrooms, dismantled rivals, and dictated the rules of her own empire, was now standing in the middle of a courtroom facing the one thing she couldn't manipulate: consequences. She knew how to wield power, money, influence, connections. But none of those things mattered here. Judge Langston leaned forward slightly. His voice when he spoke was measured, unshaken. Miss Wexley, this court is not your boardroom. Your wealth, your status, none of it changes the fact that in this space, you are a defendant. And you will be treated as one. Sloane inhaled through her nose. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing into her. The reporters were scribbling furiously, some already typing out headlines. Her legal team sat stiff, staring at her like she had just set her own defense on fire. She had to regain control. She adjusted her jacket, forcing a slow breath. Then, with the same practiced arrogance she'd carried all her life, she rolled her shoulders back and lifted her chin. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, voice smooth, I wasn't resisting. I was simply uncomfortable with being grabbed. Judge Langston's stare didn't waver. You refused to comply with a direct order from this court. I didn't refuse, she countered, a sly smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. I just didn't respond in the time you wanted. A dangerous silence followed. And then Judge Langston picked up his gavel, a single, controlled knock against the bench. Bailiff. The bailiff stepped forward again, more deliberate this time. Miss Wexley, I am holding you in contempt of court. It hit like a punch. Even her attorneys, seasoned professionals used to cleaning up disasters, looked like they had been gut-punched. One of them, the junior associate who had barely spoken since the trial began, covered his mouth like he had just witnessed a car crash. Sloane blinked. Contempt. She'd heard the word before. She knew what it meant. But it had never applied to her. Until now. Are you serious? Her voice was quieter this time. Controlled, but laced with something foreign. Uncertainty. Judge Langston's expression remained unreadable. You are to be taken into custody for the remainder of today's proceedings. Your attorneys may request a motion for release after court adjourns. A ripple of shock tore through the crowd. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. One woman, seated near the back, whispered, "Oh my God." Sloane's hands curled into fists. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She wasn't supposed to be losing. But when the bailiff stepped behind her, when she felt the firm, undeniable grip of control being stripped from her hands, something inside her cracked. She whirled around. You can't be serious. But Judge Langston was already moving on. He wasn't looking at her anymore. To him, she was no longer the center of the universe. And for the first time in her life, Sloane Wexley had to face a reality she wasn't prepared for. She was no longer untouchable. Part 4. The handcuffs. The metallic click of handcuffs wasn't just a sound. It was a shift in power. Sloane's arms were pulled behind her back, wrists locked in cold steel. And for the first time since she had entered that courtroom, she felt it. Control slipping through her fingers. The cameras caught everything. Reporters pushed closer, their lenses trained on the woman who once sat atop the tech world, now reduced to a defendant in cuffs. Her attorneys were already scrambling. Marshal Grayson stepped forward, voice sharp and urgent. Your Honor, we request an immediate reversal of the contempt order. Ms. Wexley was simply. Judge Langston barely glanced up. Denied. Sloane clenched her jaw. Her breath was tight in her chest, not out of fear, out of rage. She had been in boardrooms with kings and presidents. She had negotiated billion-dollar deals in high-rise offices that judges like Langston could never step foot in. And now she was standing here, in handcuffs, like a criminal. The bailiff moved to guide her toward a holding cell. But before he could, Sloane Wexley did something no one expected. She turned, looked directly at Judge Langston, and spoke. Tell me something, Judge, she said, her voice carrying across the dead-silent courtroom. Would you have done this if I weren't who I am? The question hung in the air. It was deliberate. A trap. A move she had used countless times. Force the opposition to question their own authority. Plant the idea of bias, make them defensive. A dangerous gamble. But Judge Langston didn't take the bait. He let the silence sit just long enough to remind her who controlled this space. Then, with a calm that was far more powerful than any outburst could ever be, he spoke. Miss Wexley, you are standing before this court not because of who you are, but because of what you have done. A single sentence. One that landed heavier than anything she had thrown at him. Because it was the truth. Sloane felt her stomach twist. For the first time, she saw something in Judge Langston's eyes that she hadn't noticed before. Not anger, not even authority. But certainty. This wasn't a man trying to prove a point. This was a man who had already won. And Sloane Wexley, for all her wealth, for all her brilliance, had no way to stop it. Her lips parted slightly, as if to fire back, as if to claw back any amount of control. But no words came. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't a game she could win. The bailiff stepped forward. Let's go. And just like that, the trial was no longer about power. It was about what happens when power means nothing. Part 5. The verdict. 2 weeks had passed since Sloane's contempt charge. 2 weeks of sitting silently beside her legal team, watching as witness after witness took the stand. Former employees, financial analysts, regulatory officials, even some of her former board members, people she had handpicked, people she had trusted. They all said the same thing. Sloane Wexley had knowingly defrauded investors. She had manipulated numbers, pressured employees to falsify reports, and when investigators started asking questions, she had obstructed justice. The evidence was damning. Emails, memos, voice recordings. Text messages that she thought were encrypted, all of it laid bare for the jury to see. Her attorneys tried everything. They argued technicalities. They questioned the credibility of witnesses. They even suggested that Sloane was the victim of a coordinated attack by competitors jealous of her success. But none of it was working. Because the truth was simple. Sloane Wexley had broken the law. And she had done it deliberately, repeatedly, without remorse. Now, she sat in the defendant's chair, wrists free from cuffs but the weight of the past few weeks heavier than steel. The contempt charge had delayed proceedings, but it hadn't stopped them. If anything, it had given the prosecution more ammunition, proof that Sloane Wexley believed she was above the law. Her legal team had worked around the clock, scrambling to undo the damage she had done to herself. They argued that the case was overblown, that the evidence was circumstantial, that no direct orders could be tied to her. But the truth was simple. The jury didn't like her. It wasn't just the fraud. It wasn't just the financial deception. It was her. She had spent years building an empire on arrogance. She had bulldozed competition, made enemies of regulators, treated everyone who challenged her as beneath her. And now it had caught up to her. The jury had deliberated for less than 7 hours. That wasn't a good sign. Judge Langston entered the courtroom for the final time in this case. The room stood. This time, Sloane stood too, not out of respect, not because she wanted to. Because she knew better now. The jury foreperson rose. A middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a steady voice. In the case of the United States versus Sloane Wexley, we find the defendant. The pause was excruciating. Guilty on all counts. Silence. Then a wave of hushed murmurs. A sharp breath from one of her attorneys. A rustle of movement from the press as they scribbled out their headlines. Sloane didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't react. Because this wasn't supposed to happen. She had always assumed she'd walk away. Maybe a fine, maybe a few public apologies, a strategic reinvention with the help of PR firms. Not this. Her mind barely registered Judge Langston's voice as he addressed the court. Given the severity of these crimes, and the clear and deliberate efforts to mislead investors and regulatory bodies, this court finds it appropriate to impose the following sentence. He listed the charges, the damages, the sentences that would run consecutively. A total of 18 years. 18 years. She felt distant from her own body. Her attorneys were already speaking, already filing motions, requesting appeals. But none of it mattered. She was going to prison. Not a white-collar resort where billionaires did time with private chefs and tennis courts. Federal prison. Sloane Wexley, who had once dictated the future of technology, who had sat on magazine covers as a symbol of power and success, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Judge Langston's gaze met hers one last time. And though his face remained calm, his message was clear. Power is meaningless when you think you're above consequence. The bailiff stepped forward again. And this time, Sloane didn't resist. Because for the first time in her life, she understood something she never had before. She had lost. Part 6. The Fall. The world didn't stop when Sloane Wexley went to prison. The stock market didn't crash. The tech industry didn't collapse. Life just continued. And that was perhaps the cruelest realization of all. For someone who had spent decades building an image of indispensability, the swift adaptation of the world to her absence was a blow more painful than any prison sentence. Her first night at FCI Dublin, a medium-security federal prison for women in California, was a shock to the system. Gone were the silk sheets, the climate-controlled bedroom, the luxury toiletries. In their place, a thin mattress on a metal frame, communal showers with lukewarm water, and a cellmate who didn't know who Sloane Wexley was and wouldn't have cared if she did. You get used to it, her cellmate, a woman named Tara serving 5 years for embezzlement, had said without looking up from her paperback novel. The routine helps. But Sloane didn't want to get used to it. Getting used to it meant accepting that this was her life now. And acceptance had never been part of her vocabulary. The first month was a blur. Visits from her legal team, discussions about appeals, strategy sessions that seemed more like desperate grasping at straws than actual plans. The appeals process could take years. Marshal Grayson had told her, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like resignation. In the meantime, I'd advise you to adjust. Adjust. As if this were just another business challenge to overcome. As if she could strategize her way out of steel bars and concrete walls. Outside, the media circus continued. Every financial publication had their take. Every tech analyst offered their opinion. Everyone seemed to have something to say about the fall of Sloane Wexley. Tech titan toppled. Inside Sloane Wexley's 18-year sentencing. From boardroom to cell block, the Wexley saga. Power and pride. How arrogance cost Sloane Wexley everything. She stopped reading the headlines after the second week. They all said the same thing. She had it coming. And maybe, in her quieter moments, those rare instances when the prison noise faded and she was left alone with her thoughts, maybe she knew they were right. Part 7. The Reflection. 6 months into her sentence, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Just a slow, incremental shift, like a ship changing course over miles of open ocean. It started with a program, a financial literacy workshop for women in the prison. The irony wasn't lost on Sloane. A woman who had once controlled billions being asked to teach basic budgeting. But with nothing but time on her hands, she agreed. Her first class was a disaster. She spoke as if addressing a boardroom, using jargon that flew over heads, displaying the same impatience with questions that had marked her corporate career. "You think you're better than us?" one woman had said, standing up halfway through Sloane's lecture on investment principles. "You think your crimes are different?" Sloane had bristled. "My situation is different." "Yeah? How?" "We both took money that wasn't ours. Just turns out you took a lot more." The simplicity of it had caught Sloane off guard. Because the woman was right. Strip away the complexity, the corporate structure, the legal framework, and what remained was a simple truth. Sloane had stolen. Deliberately. Repeatedly. With full knowledge of what she was doing. That night, lying on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, something cracked inside her. Not a breakdown. Sloane Wexley didn't break. But a fissure. A small opening through which doubt could seep. Had she really believed she was untouchable? Had she really convinced herself that rules were for other people? Had she truly become so detached from reality that she thought she could sit in a courtroom and treat a federal judge like an inconvenient employee? The answers weren't comfortable. But for the first time in her life, Sloane forced herself to confront them. The next day, she approached the woman from her class. "You're right," she said simply. "I did think I was different. Better. I was wrong." The woman had looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "First honest thing you've probably said in years." And it was true. Because honesty hadn't been part of Sloane's world for a very long time. Truth was malleable in her universe. Something to be shaped, twisted, manipulated to serve her needs. Reality was whatever she declared it to be. Until it wasn't. Until a judge with steady eyes and an unwavering voice reminded her that some truths are immutable. That consequences aren't negotiable. That power, no matter how vast, has limits. She restarted the financial literacy class the following week. This time, she spoke plainly. She answered questions patiently. She listened more than she talked. And something unexpected happened. She found purpose. Not the kind that came with stock options and executive titles, but something quieter, more genuine. For the first time in her adult life, Sloane Wexley was contributing without taking. She was giving without calculating the return. She was simply helping. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was a step away from the person she had been. The person who had stood in that courtroom, back turned to authority, certain of her own invincibility. That woman seemed distant now. A stranger with familiar features. Part 8. The Legacy. 3 years into her sentence, Sloane received a visitor she hadn't expected. Daniel Cho, the former financial officer whose testimony had been pivotal in her conviction. "Why are you here?" she asked, no warmth in her voice. Old habits died hard. Cho looked older, more assured than he had on the witness stand. Less afraid. "I wanted to see you," he said simply. I wanted to know if you understood yet. Understood what? Why I testified. Why all of us did. Sloane had spent many nights thinking about the parade of witnesses. Former employees, colleagues, people she had trusted, who had taken the stand against her. In her darkest moments, she had seen them as traitors. In her clearer ones, she recognized them as people who had simply told the truth. You did it because you had to, she said. Because you were under oath. Cho shook his head. I did it because what we were doing was wrong. What you asked us to do, it wasn't just illegal. It was destructive. People lost everything because of those falsified reports. Retirement funds. College savings. Life's work gone because we lied about numbers on a spreadsheet. The human cost. That was what Sloane had never allowed herself to consider. The real people affected by her decisions. The lives altered, sometimes irreparably, by her pursuit of more wealth, more power, more control. I never thought about it that way, she admitted, and the admission felt like peeling off a layer of skin. Painful, exposing, but necessary. I know, Cho said. That was the problem. When he left, he handed her a folder, records of a foundation he had started, dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud rebuild their lives. It was called Second Chance Initiative. We could use someone who understands both sides, he said. When you get out. The folder sat untouched on her shelf for weeks. She couldn't bring herself to open it, to face the detailed accounts of lives she had helped destroy. But eventually, she did. And what she found wasn't just stories of loss. It was stories of resilience. People who had lost everything and started again. People who had faced unimaginable setbacks and persevered. People, Sloane realized, who were stronger than she had ever been. Because real strength wasn't about domination or control. It wasn't about bending others to your will or bulldozing opposition. It was about facing consequences. Accepting responsibility. Finding purpose in places you never thought to look. It was about recognizing that true power comes not from what you take, but from what you give. Part 9. The Return. 18 years was reduced to 12 for good behavior. 12 years that transformed Sloane Wexley in ways that no one, least of all herself, could have predicted. The woman who walked out of FCI Dublin on a crisp autumn morning bore little resemblance to the one who had entered. Physically, yes, the years had left their mark. Lines around her eyes, grey threading through once dark hair, a posture that spoke of time spent in spaces not designed for comfort. But the real changes were deeper. Invisible to cameras, but evident to anyone who spoke with her. The arrogance was gone. So was the reflexive defensiveness, the need to dominate every interaction, the belief that vulnerability was weakness. In their place was something that looked almost like wisdom, a quiet assurance that came not from wealth or position, but from having faced the worst and survived. The media was waiting, of course. The story was too good to pass up. The fallen titan emerges. But the questions they came armed with, about revenge, about comebacks, about reclaiming her empire, fell flat against Sloane's new reality. I'm not interested in going back, she told the first reporter who asked about her plans to re-enter the tech world. Moving forward is hard enough. The speculation was immediate. Was Sloane Wexley broken? Had prison destroyed her ambition? Had the system beaten the fight out of one of business's most formidable warriors? They were asking the wrong questions. Because Sloane wasn't broken. She was rebuilt. Not lesser, but different. Not defeated, but redirected. Her first stop after release wasn't a luxury hotel or a high-priced restaurant. It was a community center in Oakland where the Second Chance Initiative had set up an office. Daniel Cho was waiting. Ready to work, he asked, no preamble, no fanfare. Yes, she said simply. And she meant it. The work was unglamorous. Counseling sessions with fraud victims. Educational workshops about financial safety. Advocacy for stronger corporate accountability laws. Nothing that would make headlines or earn millions. But for the first time in her life, Sloane measured success not by what she gained, but by what she gave. There were hard days. Days when the weight of what she had done, the lives altered by her choices, felt unbearable. Days when former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her. Days when she woke up missing the power she once wielded like a weapon. But there were good days too. Days when someone looked her in the eye and said thank you without wanting anything in return. Days when she used her knowledge, the same knowledge that had once built an empire, to help someone rebuild a life. And slowly, the good days began to outnumber the bad. Part 10. The Redemption. The invitation came 5 years after her release. A speaking engagement at her alma mater's business school. The topic, ethical leadership in the digital age. Her first instinct was to decline. Who was she to speak about ethics? What right did she have to stand before young, ambitious minds and caution them against the very path she had traveled? But Daniel Cho, now a close friend and colleague, saw it differently. Who better? He asked. You've seen both sides. You know the price of putting profit above principle. That's a perspective they need to hear. So she accepted. And on a clear spring morning, Sloane Wexley, former CEO, former inmate, former symbol of unchecked ambition, stood before an audience of business students who had studied her rise and fall in their ethics courses. She didn't prepare a speech, didn't rehearse talking points, just stepped to the podium and spoke from a place of hard-earned truth. I was wrong, she began. No preamble, no excuses. Not just legally wrong, morally wrong. And if I can save even one of you from making the same mistakes, then perhaps there's some meaning in what happened. She told them about the courtroom, about turning her back on the judge, about the moment the handcuffs closed around he.